Now, under siege.
Thank you all so much. As Brooks mentioned, I have crazy hair, but it is under a hat. Let's get started. So before I even talk about Angular, I'm going to talk about design patterns and kind of at a higher level, what are we doing here? Because you probably have heard that there's lots of other front-end frameworks out there. They all do things very similarly. They're just different in certain ways. But design patterns is what it comes down to. They're all following the same MVC design pattern. And once you learn that pattern, you can pretty much learn any other framework that follows that. This is my break timer. Everyone reach into the sky. Also, cool. So, first objective, please read it.
Define design pattern.
The next objective.
Define and extract terms in MVC.
First one.
Model.
Next one.
View.
Next one.
Controller.
Next one.
Well,
Next one.
Component.
Cool. So we're going to talk about MVC, but also these other terms that you're going to hear everywhere else in MVC. And you've probably already heard in doing server-side rendering with Express, you've heard of layout and partial or routes on the back end. But all of these terms are very common and used throughout front-end frameworks. So what is a design pattern? Patterns are formalized best practices that the programmer can use to solve common problems when designing an application or system. Now, it sounds fancy, but design pattern is really just putting a word on a thing that we see every day and use every day. So the people that came up with these design patterns are not geniuses. They didn't come up with this new way of doing things and everybody should do it. You see it so often in the programming world that we've decided to put a name on it. So in the case of model view controller, that is the thing that we're calling it, and we see it all throughout programming. So here I have, it's a description or template for how to solve a problem that can be used in many different situations. So that's why we have all these different front-end frameworks, Vue, React, Angular, Ember, anything else. They all follow kind of that same pattern, but they're just doing it in different ways. So it is not a finished design that can be transformed directly into source or machine code. It's kind of at a higher level describing what the thing itself is. I'll share the slide deck out afterwards. I have links out to Wikipedia talking about design patterns, architecture styles, stuff like that. But specifically, we care about MVC. This is the design pattern. We're not going to be implementing it. We're going to be using a library that implements it for us. So the main idea here is separation of concerns. And you've dealt with this for, I'm sure, most of your programming career up to this point. CSS in one file, JavaScript in one file, HTML in another file. The layout, the style, and the interactivity are all in separate files. We're separating that out so we can keep ourselves organized. It's the exact same idea with model view controller. We're separating out the view layer, the control layer, which is kind of like the glue between the view and the model, and then the model, which is the data itself, which is what we're trying to represent in our views. So I like to call it model view Cthulhu, just because there are so many potential possibilities for the C. There's model view controller, a model view presenter, a model view view model, a model view whatever. You'll commonly hear NV star when we're talking about these things. But really, you have these two things. You have the view. The view is what the user sees. The model is the data behind that view. So when we're thinking about, if you think back to your Q1 projects, you were making API requests and getting JSON data, using that in the app. The JSON data is the model. That's the data that your app is actually representing. The view was a result of you doing DOM manipulation to actually create that view. So this thing in the middle, the Cthulhu, that is the controller. It's the thing that mediates between the model and the view. It takes the data, does some modifications on it, and lets the view know so the view can reflect those changes. But you're going to hear it called a lot of other things. Model view controller, model view view model view presenter, model view whatever. Whatever you hear, it's all kind of in the same fashion. You have your data, you have your view, and then something in between that's kind of like the mediator. So kind of described it already, but the model is where the application's data object are stored. It knows absolutely nothing about the views and controllers. So in terms of separation of control, Separation of concern. We're taking all of the data and just keeping it in one place. And you can think of just like a JSON object. Basically, all the data in your app is going to be stored in that JSON object. But it doesn't care what the view looks like. It doesn't care how it's going to be controlled. It is solely the data. And when changes occur, the model notifies observers. This happens in various frameworks, and this kind of is what's going to happen in Angular. You set up the data. The moment something on the data changes, your controller kicks in and updates the view for you. But we'll get into that. Now, the view. The view is what is presented to the users and how the users interact with the application. So this is buttons. This is input boxes. This is displayed images. This is the actual thing that they're seeing. But we're separating it from the data itself. It's not intermingled like it often is with jQuery, where you have API requests and DOM manipulation kind of all mixed into one. We totally separate it out. We have our view here and our data over here. And then lastly, we have our Cthulhu. This can be known as the decision maker. In Angular, you commonly hear it as the glue between the model and the view. It's the thing that really brings the two together. So the model is totally standalone. The view knows pretty much nothing about the model, but the Cthulhu in the middle mediates and sends data from the model to the view. And if something changes in the view, like you're typing it into an input box or you're clicking on something that needs to update the model, the decision maker will update the model. But they're separated out.
CJ?
Yes?
So the controller goes both ways then. So it sends it from one to the other and other back.
It's the thing that mediates between the two. So because we have that separation, so the view is just what we can see. The data is just the data. The thing in the middle is what knows about both and knows how to create that interaction. And so update the view when the model changes and update the model when the user manipulates the view. This is kind of the magic of Angular. So once we start to create Angular controllers, we simply just update a property on the model and it instantly reflects in the view. Or if we change something in the view, it will instantly update on the model. So this idea of these three things working together and then having like a very powerful decision maker in the middle is what makes this design pattern very powerful. Let's do some quick checks for understanding. So let's do 20 seconds on the clock. Just think to yourself, what is the model, what is the view, and what is the controller? Not 20 minutes. Or the Cthulhu. I don't know how to spell Cthulhu. Cthulhu. Okay, turn to someone at your table and describe to them in your own words, what is the model, what is the view, and what is the controller?
The big monster.
All right, let's bring it back. If you can hear the sound of my voice, clap one time. The sound of my voice, clap 2 times. Cool. Who wants to share something that somebody at your table said? Did anybody come up with any analogies, or you had a good explanation of what it was?
So I just heard Justin say that a model is like where your data storage is almost like a quasi database for your information.
Yeah, you think about it, it's like a database on the front end. We're not using SQL to query it or anything like that, but it's all just the data. What do you guys have?
Oh, you said that the model's like
Like the honey badger? Honey badger don't care.
yeah.
And in a way, it doesn't. Like and that's this idea of separation of concerns. Like it is literally just the data, nothing to do with the view or how it's manipulated, just the data. Did anybody come up with analogies or other things that were helpful?
I just had a question. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't be stored on like a server in a database. Can it be stored locally, like in a JSON object? Is that how typically?
And that's the idea. Like it's stored in memory in JavaScript. So like the page loads and you have like the initial model, which may be empty. Then an API request is made, you get to the data, and that gets put onto the model. But it's still kind of just in the browser and in memory.
Is that done by the controller? Is that the controller going to make the request to fill the actual data?
Yes,
Okay.
typically done by the controller. We'll talk about in more advanced techniques, you're actually using something called a service, which interacts with the controller. But yes, that is kind of abstracted out from the model itself. The model doesn't even know where it came from. It's just the data. Yes?
What if you have multiple or disparate data sources?
Then you have a more complex app. So we'll talk about how services can help manage data from different sources, and also you're going to have multiple controllers in your app, and maybe they all want access to that same data. So typically a service is what kind of mediates that. So instead of the controller requesting the data directly from the API, the controller talks to a service which manages, okay, have I made the API request before? If I have, just give the data back. If not, wait, get the data. But the service can kind of be like the source of truth to the model versus the controller just simply doing that. But that's definitely more advanced techniques. Wonderful. Some other terms you're going to hear in the world of MVC is layout. You've probably heard this if you ever used, I guess like Jade has a layout in server-side templating. I don't know if Handlebars does. Handlebars does, yeah. They have like a layout file. But this is the UI shell of an application, including reusable components like header, body, container, footer. I'm going to talk about in a second single-page applications. The idea being that your app is kind of like a placeholder for the app that's going to be living in the middle of it. So you have the outer components like the header, the footer, but all of the actual pages will be loaded dynamically into the center. So this outer portion is the layout. It's kind of everything, and then the center is what's more dynamic. A partial, a single view that can be reused throughout the application. So we're going to be creating templates, which basically represent a single view, and those templates could be used with multiple controllers. At first, we're not really going to be doing that, but the idea is you can create these reusable partials that are reused throughout your app. And a partial is really just a little bit of HTML. It's like, you could have a partial for the nav bar that's just like the header and some links. Or a partial for a loading bar that's like a loading image. And then anywhere else you need that, you could use that partial elsewhere. You have a question?
That was going to be my question. Was it kind of individual components of the view as well?
Yeah, it's like really all the view needs for that thing. It's not the HTML tag, it's not everything around it. It's just like specific for that one single view. What does that view need?
So on that, will views end up being generally a conglomerate of like multiple partials?
They can be, yeah. And really that's when you're really getting used to everything. At first, you're just going to have like one template to one controller, but eventually you're going to create like smaller components and they have like much smaller partials. A route maps a URL to a view and a controller. Can I get a raise of a hand? Where have you seen a route before?
In galvanized reads.
Yes, you've been using routes extensively. So someone describe to me in your own words, what is an express router? Let's see, a raise of a hand. Well, like an express route handler. What is it?
It's a piece of middleware in your server to tell to receive information from the front end and then to do something with it on your back end, whether you're hitting the database or you're sending something back to the front end one way or another.
Cool. So that you've kind of described like the function itself. What else like makes up the route?
A query to your database.
Answer?
I was going to say the path and the HTTP method.
Right, so like describing like what kind of request is this thing going to handle. So like get, post, put, and then the path is when the request comes in, if it matches this URL, then run that request handler. But so in Express, your route handlers are mapping paths and verbs to route handlers. In Angular, we're going to have routes that just map a URL to a specific controller in view. But it's the same thing, but on the front end. And a component. So we're going to talk a lot about components, and this is another key word that you're going to see throughout these front-end frameworks like Vue and React and all these others. You build components. So a component is an atomic UI piece that is composable and reusable and should work with other pieces in a way that's performant. You had a question?
You said like in Angular, routes are going to be just how we map components and then use them in our routes or in our path, like with a specific path.
Yes. So
maybe give me that one more time.
I'm going to show a demo of it soon, so I'll wait for that. But the idea is you have a client-side URL that whenever that changes, Angular decides what component to load in.
Cool.
It's cool. It is cool.
That makes like less routes, right? So every time. Cool.
Yeah, and the idea is you're going to have client-side routes, and then your server-side is just JSON. Like you will no longer have server-side rendering. Your server just sends back JSON. Your front end manages that data and uses it to display different views. But this idea of a component, it's reusable. So so web components are becoming a thing. It's like a standard in the web browser. But if you think of something like, let's say, a Twitter feed, you have like list of users, their most recent post, and that's you've seen it on many sites. It's like a Twitter feed, right? Like it describes what the Twitter feed is. It's sitting there like in the sidebar. But what if that Twitter feed was a component? It was literally represented as an HTML element. So greater than Twitter-feed, close the greater than, and then a closing tag. Drop that tag in on any site, and you instantly get a Twitter feed without having to know the AJAX code required to get the data in, without having to know about the styles. A component is literally just the tag describing what the thing does. So with Angular, we're going to be creating custom components. We can create a header component, and a view component, and a button component, or a loading component. But this component is then totally reusable throughout our site. So we take that tag, we can throw it on different pages, and we get the exact same functionality anywhere we throw that tag. It's reusable code. All right. Quick review. Everyone think to yourself for a few seconds, what is a design pattern? I'm going to cold call. Sorry, I don't know your name, sir, but what is a design pattern in your own words? And what's your name?
My name is Jackson.
Hello, Jackson.
A design pattern, I guess potentially it would be the way that a program can interact with its view in the browser and also the data that it has, and all the entities that go along with it.
Anybody help him out? Other thoughts?
Reusable solution to a specific problem.
Yeah, so you kind of got more specific to talking about MVC, but at a higher level, a reusable solution in some way. So the design pattern we're talking about is MVC, but design patterns as a whole, there are a lot of other ones out there. There's the observer pattern, and there's a book written on patterns.
Take your word for it.
Yeah, there's a book somewhere in the building. But just tons of patterns that people have come across in the programming world, and they've just written about them. So now, and really it becomes kind of like a conversation tool. So instead of every time you're having a conversation with another coder or a lead or something like that, and instead of having to say, you know the thing where we have like the view, but it's separate from the data, like instead, we're using MVC, and everybody knows what you're talking about. So these design patterns it's just kind of like a word that you can give to something, so it's easier to talk about with other developers. I'll share this slide deck out. There are so many other MV stars. So model view controller, model view presenter, model view view model view hierarchical model view controller, model view adapter. But all of these, same idea, right? Separation of concerns, and you have something mediating in between. I'm now going to go into Angular. If the snack tree is out there, I will give you moments to go grab it. Go.
Sorry, I've been ravaged by 51.
And I'll make a new video.